Okay, again, welcome. We're really glad to have you here. We're looking forward to more time together with Jason. Jason is the archivist, that's true, with Mennonite Church USA in Elkhart, and has agreed to be a part of us this weekend. Jason is a native of Wayne County, having grown up in Dalton. His dad and mom are here today, and his wife and children are joining us. Don Steiner is the great uncle of Jason. So if you have any questions at all, check with Don. He'll have the answers. And then check that with Jason too and make sure they're correct. So this morning's session is a time of dialogue with PJ and Jason. And we're looking forward to that time, and I'll turn it over to you.
So last night I just wanted to review some of the things that I ended with last night, which were the three themes that I had identified that make Oak Grove's history unique in comparison to a lot of other Mennonite congregations. Thank you. In North America. And so the three themes that I talked about briefly at the end of last night were Oak Grove's tradition of this congregational approach to leadership and decision-making in the life of the church. So the heavy involvement of both ordained and lay leaders in the church from a very early date. The second point was the early and sustained involvement of Oak Grove in Mennonite institutions of higher education, specifically, particularly Goshen College and Bluffton College. And then the third one was the early involvement in home and overseas missions and service organizations. And so I think all three of these legacies have shaped Oak Grove's history and continue to shape its history today, as well as the broader Mennonite community. So today I want to take some time to talk about the story of a person who I think kind of embodies some of these three themes that have shaped Oak Grove's history. And so the story that I want to tell is the story of Chrissy Yoder Shank, who was a writer, editor, teacher, and missionary to India who died in 1929 at the young age of 41, shortly after she'd given birth to her 8th child. And so I'm curious how many of you are familiar with the story of Chrissy Yoder Shank? Anybody? A show of hands? So a few of you are familiar, or James is familiar, so with the story of Chrissy Yoder Shank. And interestingly enough, we've got a really, really rich collection from Charles and Chrissy Yoder Shank at the archives, and it's currently sitting in about five banker-style boxes, and I just discovered when I was preparing for this event that it's never really been gone through and processed, and there are these fascinating letters that Chrissy, in the back, her parents were John A. Yoder and Sadie Newhouser Yoder. So I'll kind of.
C.C. was her grandfather.
I guess I'll defer to you on that one. I'm not.
I think that's.
Yeah. So I think her story is perhaps not as well known as some other pioneering Oak Grove mission workers, such as Jacob and Lina Zook Ressler, and their daughters Ruth and Rhoda Ressler, and you can read about their stories in Levi Miller's new book. But her legacy and impact on the broader Mennonite church has been equally significant. And so as I learned more about Chrissy, one thing that stuck out to me was the interconnectedness of Amish Mennonite communities in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, and across the Midwest, and the mobility of Mennonite families who traveled between those locations during the 19th century. I always kind of thought of Mennonite communities as being kind of rooted to places, but there was a lot of back and forth between these various Amish Mennonite communities in the 19th century. And this is what historian James O. Lehman calls the restless frontier. So her mother, Chrissy's mother, Sadie Newhouser Yoder, this is Charles, Chrissy, and Ruth, with a photo taken of them while they were in India. So her mother was Sadie Newhouser Yoder. And she was born in 1861 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And her father was John A. Yoder, who was born in Wayne County. And sometime after they married in 1885, they moved to Holden, Missouri, which is where Chrissy was born in 1888. And she was the oldest of 3 children, and when she was little, her parents decided to move back to Ohio, and they put down roots here in the Oak Grove community. So Chrissy Yoder grew up in the Oak Grove community and was baptized at the age of 13. And she attended and later taught in the public school system in the area in Wayne County before leaving to attend Goshen College, where she graduated in 1913. And then after that, she moved to Kansas, where she served as Dean of Women and taught English at Bethel College for 1 year. So Chrissy Yoder was part of this early wave of Oak Grove young people to attend the Mennonite institution of higher education. While at Goshen College, she met Charles L. Schenck, who was also born and raised in Missouri, and they were married in 1914, a year after she had left for Kansas. She ended up moving back, getting married to Charles L. Schenck. And Charles Schenck was also has a lot of family history and connections to Mennonite missions and the Mennonite church in general. So J.W. Schenck, who was the first Mennonite missionary to Argentina, was a brother to Charles Schenck. And then Molly Schenck, who was a sister, was married to Daniel Kaufman, who was a longtime Mennonite denominational leader and did a lot of work with the publishing house in Scottsdale. So this is a picture of Chrissy. I think this was actually in Japan en route to India from the United States. They kind of made a stop in Japan, and so this is a picture of her being pulled on a cart. So both Chrissy and Charles were heavily influenced by the growing missionary movement among Mennonites, and they left in 1915 for service in Damtari, India, through the Mennonite Board of Missions. And during their time in India, Charles had studied mechanical engineering at Purdue University, so he had this engineering background, and he was kind of recruited to go to India, and he worked to establish an industrial arts program there in central India, teaching trade skills to Indian youth, young Indian men who had been orphaned following the Great Famine in the 1890s. And then Chrissy worked as a grassroots evangelist with Indian women and also wrote regular essays and reports on her experience that were sent back to the United States and published in some of the Mennonite publishing house publications like Youth's Christian Companion, which was geared towards younger people in the Mennonite church. Her reports were later compiled and published in a widely read book. This is another picture of Charles and Chrissy with a group of other missionaries. And I think J.W. Schenck is standing there on the back right, and Charles and Chrissy are on the back row on the left. There's a lot of really fascinating historical photographs at the archive, so I had a lot of fun going through those. So she ended up publishing this book called Letters from Mary in 1924, and this was kind of a fictionalized account of her experiences in India, written from the perspective of a teenage girl. So it was geared towards young audiences, kind of trying to teach young Mennonites in the United States about the realities of life in India and working there as a missionary. And this was a pretty widely read publication, at least in Mennonite circles. According to her son, David Schenck, this made her the first published female Mennonite author, publishing this book in 1924. Unfortunately, during a period of only about 4 years, they were there Chrissy and Charles were there from 1915 to 1919. And during that 4-year period, their first child, Ruth, was chronically ill. She was pictured in that first photograph that I showed. And then their first son, John died shortly after he was born, about a month after he was born. And this is all kind of documented in the letters that she was writing home to her family, which is it's really kind of touching and sad to see her have to report that to her family. So because of these health concerns, Chrissy and Charles returned to the United States and settled in Northeast Ohio in 1919. After returning from India, Chrissy continued to work as a writer and editor for several Mennonite publications and emerged as a leader in the broader Mennonite church. And she was only in her 30s at this time. For example, she was one of several people instrumental to the creation of the Mennonite Women's Missionary Society, which later became the Women's Missionary and Service Commission of the Old Mennonite Church. She edited its publication, The Monthly Letter, for several years, and also served as missions editor for the Christian Exponent, which was a short-lived publication that was spearheaded by people here in the Oak Grove community: Vernon Smucker, Lester Hostetler, D.S. Gehrig, and several other people. Chrissy was also a gifted speaker. Her cousin, Catherine A. Smucker, wrote that Chrissy could, quote, hold the attention and sway an audience of thousands. So even before she attended college, she was a regular speaker at local church events here in the Oak Grove community. And she was also a featured speaker at her commencement from Goshen College and helped supervise the debate team and the volunteer band when she was at Bethel College for that 1 year after she graduated. So before an event that she organized at the college in March 1914, Chrissy wrote the following lines to her future husband, Charles. There's a lot of love letters between Chrissy and Charles during that year in the archives as well. And she said, "I'm not sure what President Cleaver," he was the president of Bethel College at that time, "I'm not sure what he thinks of my leading it, for he's neither a believer in woman suffrage nor in woman church talkers. But I yielded to the wishes of the band this time, as I've done before." After returning from India, she was also invited to speak at the Young People's Conference and also spoke about her experiences in India at several Mennonite church congregations. And of course, this was on top of her many responsibilities as a mother to 7 children, and 6 of those 7 children were born in the 10 years from 1919 to 1929. I think much could be said about Chrissy Yoder Shank's legacy, but I'll try to limit myself to just a few things. First, I think her story serves as a striking example of early leadership for women in the Oak Grove community, among several others, such as Lina Zook Ressler. While she was not an ordained pastor, well, this didn't happen until, at least officially, until the 1970s in the Mennonite Church and the General Conference Church. So she wasn't an ordained minister, but she performed many roles that were traditionally occupied by men in the church, including public speaking and serving as editors of church publications. So I think this is a good example of Oak Grove's tradition of congregationalism, or the priesthood of all believers. She, along with many others, helped pave the way for future leaders at Oak Grove, such as Martha Smith Good, L.C. Miller, Cher Spiegel, and Norma Dirksen. Chrissy also left an impact on the broader church through the lives of her children, many of whom went on to serve in various parts of the church. So this is a picture that I love of Chrissy at her typewriter. It's undated. Mary Shank was one of their children, Charles and Chrissy's children. Mary Shank and Ernest Lehman served with the Mennonite Central Committee for 19 years in Akron, Pennsylvania, Israel, Palestine, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Glenn and Lois Shank Musselman served in several locations throughout Brazil for 36 years with Mennonite Board of Missions. Esther May Shank was a registered dietitian, and she studied at Case Western and Cleveland Medical Center and served as an instructor and dietitian at many institutions over her career, some Mennonite, some non-Mennonite, including Messiah College, hospitals in Elkhart and Goshen, La Junta, Colorado, Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Showalter Retirement Villa in Heston, Kansas, and then at the end of her career, she relocated to Arkansas and worked at a community medical center in Calico Rock, Arkansas. And then finally, David A. and Wilma Holopeter Shank served with Mennonite Board of Missions in Belgium for 23 years and West Africa for another 10 years. And then Wilma and David also helped found Assembly Mennonite Church in Goshen, which is the church that I currently attend. And I also have a personal connection to Wilma and David because my wife Lisa and I got to be really good friends with their grandson, Absalom Shank, when we were living in North Carolina. The stories of Chrissy Yoder Shank and her children make me think of the branches of a tree that are interconnected and overlap with the stories of dozens of other Oak Grove families who have committed their lives to the service of the Mennonite Church in both big and small ways for 2 centuries. So while today we see things like getting a college education or serving with MCC or Mennonite Mission Network as commonplace, they were not nearly as common in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Chrissy Yoder Shank and her contemporaries from Oak Grove really were at the front lines of these activities among Mennonites at the time, and their pioneering efforts had an impact on the broader Mennonite church that we're still feeling today.
This time is billed for sharing of stories, and we really do hope that you have some that you have thought of, or comments or questions that you'd like to raise, and we'll want to give opportunity for that at the close of this hour. I would like to say something further, though, in regards to the timeline, which you see around the sanctuary. You'll notice that there are three rather distinct bands of information included in them. At the top are the events that particularly relate to Oak Grove. In the middle section, just under the yellow date band, are the events of the larger church, and then the lower section are other world events, which help you put it into context overall. One thing that has come to our attention is that there is a confusing little bit of information after the names of many of the ordained leaders of the congregation that needs a little interpretation. For example, Christian Brandt is listed over here, 1818, as the first minister of this congregation, and right after his name appears -1866. Well, what that intends to convey is that he was minister here from 1818 until 1866. Likewise, when Virgil Gehrig was ordained here in 1947, you'll see it back on the far panel, right after his name appears -1960. It wasn't meant to imply that he was actually ordained in 1960, but rather he served here until 1960, and then took the pastorate at Grace Mennonite Church of Pandora. So that may help clear up a few of the questions or comments that are a little bit confusing about the timeline. I was drawn to the stories of four young men of Oak Grove who were somewhat contemporary with Chrissy Yoder Shank, all born within 6 years of each other. They were from oldest to youngest. The first two are Vernon and Jesse Smucker. Vernon is on the left. Yes. And on the right is Jesse Smucker. The second set, Jacob Conrad Meyer, J.C. Meyer as he was better known. And the fourth is that of Ori Ben Gehrig, who was a part of this group of four. They were from oldest to youngest, Jacob Conrad Meyer, Vernon Smucker, Jesse Smucker, and Ori Gehrig. Two of their stories, that of J.C. and Ori Gehrig, are told in Sketches of God's Faithfulness. The other two are brothers, sons of Menno and Lydia Zook Smucker. The four actors all played in a youth movement that shaped them in the Mennonite church. Jesse Smucker had just completed elementary school. He took the normal school training that licensed him to teach school, and he began teaching at Center College. Do you know where Center College is? Some are pointing this way, and that's true. Center College was, am I correct, the local township elementary school, but for unknown reasons, they were referred to as colleges in this community. And Center College was the one immediately to the east here at the corner of Egypt and Smucker Road. He began teaching there in 1911 at the age of 18. After 3 years of teaching, Jesse enrolled at Goshen College in the fall of 1914, and his older brother, also a student at Goshen, Vernon, graduated in 1915. During Jesse's second year of college, his father was injured in a farm accident, and Jesse came home to help with farm work. That spring, Oak Grove undertook the ordination of another minister. As customary, they took nominations from the membership for ministerial candidates, and Jesse received the majority of all nominations. Because of his considerable support, the congregation proceeded to ordain Jesse in May of 1916 without the use of the lot. Incidentally, the lot was used in the ordination of J.S. Gehrig as bishop in 1912, and that was the last time the lot was ever used in any ordination here at Oak Grove. After his ordination that fall, Jesse resumed classes and graduated from Goshen in the spring of 1918. He preached at Oak Grove occasionally, went home on vacation or on summer breaks. Oak Grove valued and appreciated its youth and affirmed their involvement in the congregation, and that's a trait that continues to the present day. After college, Vernon Smucker attended Union Theological Seminary in New York for 1 year. Then he was called to Scottsdale, Pennsylvania to join the publication efforts of Jacob Ressler at the new Mennonite publishing house. In 1920, he was appointed as the new editor of the Christian Monitor, a periodical for the home and Christian worker. Its more recent counterpart was that known as the Christian Living magazine, which closed, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, something like that. Though Vernon was critical and impatient with directions within the Mennonite church, he was recognized as moderate and less outspoken than some of his cohorts. In the publishing house, Vernon was in a position of considerable influence within the broader church through the tools that were available to him through the press. We need to understand the historical context of the times. In the United States, it was an age of progress and optimism and relative peace. There was a belief that society had generally moved beyond the use of war as solution to world conflicts. In the Mennonite church, institutions and program boards had been established to carry out mission and education goals and to care for the elderly. Regional conference power rose rapidly and moved the church toward a revisionist conservatism with more rigid and uniform discipline, especially in dress. But Europe was embroiled in armed conflict that soon became known as the Great War. The United States had avoided that conflict, but by April of 1917, America was drawn into World War I. To equip its armed forces, the United States activated the military draft, which had been idle since the Civil War. World War I ended up being one of the deadliest conflicts of human history, even of modern times. For historic peace churches, the war created its own crisis of conscience. In 1917, young men were swept up in the draft, sent to military camps with little preparation for establishing positions of conscientious objection to war. Indeed, in many cases, the church had offered minimal teaching on a peace position. Once they were in the military camps, the draftees were faced with three options. One, to accept assignment in combatant services as full soldiers, or two, to serve in non-combatant assignments such as Army Medical Corps, or three, those who refused to participate in any capacity that aided the war efforts. Of Oak Grove's young men, there were some who chose all three positions. Among those who held non-resistant, conscientious objector positions were J.C. Meyer and Ori Ben-Gary. Young minister Jesse Smucker was exempt from the military draft, and his brother Vernon Smucker likely was drafted, though the details of his service are not reported. The COs detained in military camps chafed under the stigma of being called slackers for refusing to participate in the war effort. They were lonely and isolated from their supportive communities, and though the ministers spoke of the need to visit and support them, J.C. Meyer noted in his journals that he received no visits and few letters from his church pastors. Instead, he saw the church and conference leadership mired in long inaction and deliberations to arrive at resolutions that did nothing to respond to his physical and spiritual needs. Shortly after graduating from Goshen College in 1917, Ori Gehrig was drafted and held at Camp Sherman near Chillicothe, Ohio. Later, he was transferred to Haverford, Pennsylvania, just northeast of Philadelphia, where he trained for reconstruction work under the American Friends Service Committee. On November 11, 1918, the first armistice day marked the end of hostilities in Europe. But the non-resistant draftees were detained for almost 2 more months before being released. In February of 1919, J.C. Meyer finally got his opportunity for service in France, working with the Red Cross doing reconstruction work. Soon his friend Ori Gehrig joined him. Jesse Smucker believed he should do something. When opportunity arose for relief work in the Near East, he seized it. He went with 3 other young men in early 1919. Jesse operated an orphanage in Mesopotamia, which is about 3 hours northwest of present-day Baghdad, Iraq. Oak Grove supported the War Sufferers Relief Fund in spring of 1919 with offerings in excess of $2,000. Jesse served there until the fall of 1920. About the same time, a letter from Daniel Gehrig, who was the uncle of Ori Ben Gehrig, called on the Mennonite Church to do something that will prove to her critics the sincerity of her non-resistant position and to give positive expression to that principle. J.C. Meyer added the reminder that if we're going to hold the doctrine of non-resistance, we will have to prove that it works in a practical way. In partial response to the challenge of the young visionaries, the Mennonite Church established a Mennonite Relief Commission for war sufferers late in 1917, and one of the commission's first moves was to grant support to the Friends Group and to the work of the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief, later known as the Near East Relief. The Relief Commission also agreed to send 2 representatives to explore the reconstruction work. They selected Vernon Smucker and Samuel Alger, a bishop from West Liberty, Ohio, and sent them to study the need for service. While in France, J.C. Meyer and Ori Gehrig organized a gathering of young Mennonites from throughout Europe, including many Americans there in service assignments. They held a conference in June of 1919. In the course of the 2-day assembly of some 60 people, there were sermons and talks urging their development of convictions for service and to practice the teachings of Jesus as given in the Sermon on the Mount. Also participating in the meeting were the 2 official representatives of the Relief Commission, Vernon Smucker and Samuel Alger. They drafted a constitution for a young people's conference. Among their purposes was to deepen the spiritual life of the Mennonite Church, to study Mennonite social responsibility, to provide relief and reconstruction assistance, and to inspire young men and women to consecrate their lives for the principles of Christian faith. They also expressed a goal of inter-Mennonite cooperation with Mennonites in Europe and Russia. Stateside, after the leaders returned from service, a Young People's Conference held its first meeting in 1920 in West Liberty, Ohio. The second meeting was held in Sterling, Illinois in 1922, and then in June 1923 in Middlebury, Indiana, in what became its final conference session. By then, much of the leadership of the old Mennonite Church was mired in debates of fundamentalism, with many vocally opposed to the youth movement and some overtly condemning the original leaders. What became of these 4 Oak Grove actors? J.C. Meyer cut short his service in France to accept a call in 1919 to join the faculty of Goshen College. And upon the closing of the college a couple years later, J.C. lost his teaching job, and however, he found a position at Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where he taught until his retirement in 1959. J.C. and his family were actively involved here at Oak Grove through those years. Vernon Smucker returned from Europe and in 1923 began editing a new publication, The Christian Exponent, that was dedicated to the mission and ideals of the Young People's Conference movement. He headed the journal for only 2 years until financial difficulties plaguing the magazine, eventually forcing it to fold. Vernon then began teaching at Worcester High School and then served as principal there for 23 years until his retirement in 1947. He joined the First Presbyterian Church of Worcester and served in various leadership roles within that congregation. James O. Lehman points out that one of the stipulations that Vernon had before he accepted any leadership roles in that congregation was that his views as a conscientious objector would be accepted and respected, and he was assured of that, and he was involved in many aspects of leadership within the congregation. Ori Gehrig taught at Bethel College in 1920 and 21, tried unsuccessfully to apply for mission work through the Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities, and after his application stalled, he pursued a doctoral program at Harvard and then chose a career path of government service through the State Department. Jesse Smucker returned to ministry at Oak Grove, married Mary Lance in 1922, studied a year at Princeton Theological Seminary, returned to teaching for a few years, and then took 2 more years to complete his seminary at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut. Upon his return to Oak Grove, Jesse became popular as a minister with the young people. He worked with the young people's meetings, as they were called, that were widely attended by youth from throughout the community. Music was highlighted with choral groups, quartets, and ensembles. Jesse continued his ministry until 1936 when he was invited to accept a full-time pastorate at Bethel College Church in Kansas. What became of the goals of the Young People's Conference movement? On one front, the effort appeared to have fizzled out, but on closer examination, many of the aspirations of the movement took root, though several decades later. Among them, a proactive peace program, civilian public service, was developed and accepted before World War II as an alternative to military service. The Mennonite Central Committee was launched to coordinate relief efforts. The first Mennonite World Conference was held in Basel, Switzerland in 1925 and has continued periodically since. Youth gatherings evolved into the Mennonite Youth Fellowship, or MOF as we know it, in 1948, and the youth conventions now held biennially are the present-day successors. Seminary training for ministers within the Mennonite Church was realized with the founding in 1945 of Mennonite Biblical Seminary by the General Conference Mennonite Church in Chicago, and Goshen College opened the Goshen Biblical Seminary beginning in 1946. These and others were goals of the young visionaries from Oak Grove. Though their prophetic voices generated pushback and resistance within the church structures, they seemed to be in tune with streams of renewal that did not die out within the broader church. In due time, the seeds they planted, though tended and nurtured by other more cautious leaders, took root and flourished. Most would agree that the Mennonite Church is better today for their zeal. As just one little check of reality, I am wondering, is there anyone here who would have attended Oak Grove under the ministry of Jesse Gehrig? I'm sorry, Jesse Smucker, what am I saying? Marie Beachy.
I talked to Marie Beachy last night. Unfortunately, she isn't able to be here today. And I asked her what she remembers about Jesse Smucker. And she said he was a preacher that we always wanted to listen to him. And when guests came, they were always kind of disappointed that they wouldn't hear Jesse. So she remembers him well.
Okay, very good. Others may well remember, Helen.
Well, I remember him, not real good, but I know his mother was related to my grandmother.
Okay.
And when they came to Ohio from Pennsylvania to visit, they always went to see Mrs. Smooker.
Okay.
So, but that was in early years.
Mm-hmm.
Was Jesse Anna Smoker's brother?
Yes.
So a lot of us would know Anna Smoker. She was our fourth grade teacher.
Anna lived until late 90s, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
My dad, Donald Schrock, who I never knew would break a rule in all my growing up years, would talk about how the MYFers or young boys would be so glad to be in church when Jesse was speaking, but when he wasn't, then they would escape, and there's all kinds of escapade stories of what was going on during that hour or two, and then they'd be right back here when it was over, which shocks my sisters and I. And then I just wanted to add that I got to know Jesse very well when he lived at Greencroft. And one day when I took a Bethany Christian choir group to Greencroft, he came and met me and asked if Donald was my dad, or Alvin and Mary, probably my grandparents. So we became very well acquainted. I visited him many times, and that was really amazing because I could ask him about my great-grandparents that I would have never known, and he would supposedly describe them and so forth. So that blew my mind that he had been my dad's pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandparents and my great-grandparents in fellowship with them here.
Before you hand off the mic, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Diane Schrock-Hertzler. My dad and mom are Donald and Harriet, and my grandparents are Alvin and Mary Schrock.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having this.
Good.
Okay, I'm too young to remember when he was pastor here, but when he would come back for a sermon on a special Sunday, my mother would remind me, Jesse Smooker is a good preacher. You'll want to listen carefully. And I was never disappointed.
And the thing that really strikes me is that as a 23-year-old young man, those gifts of ministry and leadership were recognized by this congregation and supported. And he became a very valuable part of the congregational life in those early years. Other stories, comments?
I'll stop talking then, but he told me many times how he and Mary approached Irene and said, you can do this. We think you need to lead the Messiah. And she was, I don't know what Mark remembers hearing the story, but according to Jesse, she was not sure, and they assured her she could do it.
When they approached Mother, she had taught, she was graduated in 29 from Bluffton, taught music and home ec at Lucky, if anybody knows Lucky, Ohio, and then came back to teach at the one-room schoolhouses here in Green Township. And so she would also have the glee clubs at the high school. They never had mixed choruses then. It was always girls and boys separate. That was dangerous, I guess, to have them together. But then they went, really Mary, his wife, said, Irene, why don't you start the Messiah here? Because all of them would have sung it at either Goshen or Bluffton when they were students. So there was a core of people that knew the work, but Mother said, we don't have any piano here at Oak Grove. There's no keyboard. And Mary said, So? And so Mother, who knew syllables, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, she could just wheel those off. She was amazing. And then Francis Smooker, if any of you, he's gone now, but he would say he remembered coming to our house and sitting around Mother's kitchen table practicing different choruses at her house. And so she was amazing. You know, I was very honored to have her as a mom. Irene Ramsire Musser. Now that I have the mic, we didn't talk about the mother was the oldest of the 9 Ramsire children, and Edna was the next daughter. And so she, during World War II, wanted to be a voluntary person for the Mennonite church, and there were no avenues for her, so she went with the peace people of the Friends Church. And so, but she, at that time, was a dean of women at Bluffton College, and there would be letters printed in the Worcester paper from Edna that when she was in France and writing down all the things she did. And then she went, got her doctorate, and the same picture of the Shank lady, Edna was working in India, I think, in home ec and helping diet and so on. And that's where she met E.G. Kaufman. She probably knew him earlier too, but she ended up marrying E.G. Kaufman. So, but Edna was a real person too.
I'm Cher Spiegel-Byler, for those who don't recognize me. I was one of those who was able to be a part of the legacy. That I was associate pastor here from 1987 to 1992, which feels like a long time ago, but very, very recent. So I share this story from the more recent past, and I also give you greetings from First Mennonite Church in Canton. My husband Lauren wasn't able to be here because he's a Sunday school teacher, and soon after worship I have to buzz back to get to a church council meeting. So the legacy continues that of church leadership. But I share this quick story of one most of you wouldn't have heard, but when I was candidating, or when I was looking for a church to be a part of, the search committee here from Oak Grove came out to Elkhart, went to Elkhart and interviewed several of us. And a while after, I got a call from Jim Schrog, pastor at the time, and he invited me to come to meet the congregation, or to meet the search committee again. But he acknowledged that they weren't quite sure about my verbal skills because apparently I walked into the room of 10 people with a deer in the headlights look. And so they weren't quite sure how I would communicate and so as I drove from Elkhart to Smithville, I practiced singing and speaking songs to practice my elocution skills. And so one of the hymns that I spoke a lot, prayed a lot, came to characterize for me how I saw Oak Grove. I was focused on the chorus of it, but the first verse is very apt. God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power. Crown thine ancient church's story, bring her bud to glory's flower. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, for the facing of this hour. I was worried about facing the hour, but God has poured his grace on this congregation, and I trust God will continue to pour his grace.
Yeah, I am Clarence Stutzman. I'm a latecomer for Oak Grove. I've only been here since 1975, but I'm impressed with this Derek that you mentioned, Paul, because of the work that he did at the State Department. He was involved and drafted, or not drafted, but was summoned to help set up the League of Nations, which later then developed to the United Nations. And I think it's very important because that has, without a doubt, helped avoid a lot of conflict in the world. So I think it has a basis in Oak Grove. I just wanted to mention that.
Good morning. I'm Bonnie Lichty King, And I was just telling it, this is so much fun, and truly old is gold. I believe it. This morning, Leonard and Nancy greeted us, and then someone came up. I'm Janet Byler. And then, oh, I'm Beth. And then I met Ellen. And, you know, as young women, as girls, there came an age when, it might have been 8th grade or 9th grade, when we could join the girls back here in the anteroom before church. And then at a given point, we could all walk down that aisle there and sit here. Did we sit in front of the oldest women or right behind them? Right behind them. And so some of you may remember those days, as I do. And I found myself, as the last 20 years, Dan and I have been in Goshen, and I'm thinking, why do those kids sit with their parents in church? It'd be so much fun to sit with your peer group. and I think an experience like that has something to do with what this church means to me. And as I reflect on J.C. Meyer, I knew J.C. Meyer as a man who talked often on Sunday evenings and long. And I have no idea what he was talking about. And today I just decided maybe that's where I got my interest in fields of compassion and morphogenics. I love to read that stuff, and I must have just breathed it in. It was in the ether or the air or something, because it was just many wonderful experiences that I recall from here, and it's been a joy to be back today.
Perhaps we'll call it to a stop here. We'll have a little bit of time before church starts, and so you have a chance to get around a little bit and see one another or catch a restroom or whatever it takes. So thank you for your participation, and thank you, Paul and Jason, for leading us through those memories together. So you're excused.